Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Tina Moore, the Family Connections Manager. It is my pleasure to present to you the second Beyond Family Connections for our Family Connections Alumni Institute. We have a wonderful presenter today, and before I introduce him, I just want to give you a couple of little housekeeping things. So the chat has been disabled for this webinar. Let's put it out there. It's distracting. But we do want you to interact with our presenter. And so you can send a question through the Q&A, and we will be, myself and Doreen Dawson, who is helping to moderate this webinar, we will be giving our presenter questions throughout his presentation. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Saul Zellen. So Dr. Zellen is an adult, child, and adolescent psychiatrist. He originally trained in pediatrics. However, after 5 years of working in general pediatrics and pediatric hematology oncology, Dr. Zellen decided to move over to psychiatry, and that has now become his primary focus. He's received specialized training in multiple behavior methods of treatment, including dialectical behavior therapy, which, as you know, is the basis for our Family Connections program. He is very interested in learning how to formulate behavioral and emotional health concerns in terms of the transactional model of DBT. I have a fun fact for you. When preparing for this webinar, we sent you a survey, and when I was working with Saul on this, I said, wow, this sounds like a researcher. And he said, yes, he got that from his dad, who is a sociologist. So without further ado, I present to you Dr. Saul Zellen, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Tina and Doreen. Thank you to Family Connections for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. Today's talk is called Growing Up Online, Teens, Social Media, and Who Belongs Here Anyway? So let's jump right in. And let me make sure I can advance my slides. There we go. Okay, a quick disclaimer before we get started. I want to be very clear with everyone what this presentation is and what it is not. This presentation is not meant to be a substitute for any kind of professional evaluation and should not be used as a substitute for that. This presentation is geared towards non-professionals, and it is meant to educate and remind all of us what are the principles of the Family Connections program of the NEA-BPD in regard to this topic that I've begun to think about as the ecology of social media use in the 21st century. And so if you think that you are dealing with a situation that involves any form of mental illness, including these relatively new concepts of internet or social media addiction, or of course, if you're concerned about someone being a danger to themselves or others, a safety concern, you should absolutely consult a licensed healthcare professional. And of course, in case of emergency, should contact 911. So with that, let's jump in. I want to give you a brief overview. This presentation can really be divided into two main topics. We're going to talk about this idea of thinking about the ecology of what it's like to grow up in the 21st century as a young person. And we're going to talk about family connections. And that's basically what we're going to cover. In 1979, Frank Herbert, the author of the classic science fiction novel Dune, made this statement: the highest function of ecology is to understand consequences. And I really like this statement because as I've started thinking about these problems and started thinking about the family connections model, it came to me that we are really talking about the ecology of a problem, the ecology that people find themselves in. And this is very consistent with the DBT model. And so I remembered this quote, and I wanted to bring it to our attention that we are really talking about focusing on consequences, not focusing on blame, not focusing on linear cause and effect, but focusing on global systems and their consequences. So let's talk about some consequences. One of the consequences of growing up in the 21st century is outlined in this slide. This was a study published last year in 2020, It looked at what the authors called diagnoses of despair, diagnoses of diseases of despair. And they were basically looking at substance abuse and suicide-related diagnoses. And they looked at healthcare data from a healthcare database between 2009 and 2018, which incidentally, the smartphone was introduced in 2010 or started to really rise in popularity in 2010. It was introduced before then, but my understanding is that 2010 is when it really started to take off. What happened between 2009 and 2018? And Tina, when I move my cursor, can you see the arrow? Okay, I just want to make sure that when I'm pointing to things, people can see.
Yeah, looks great.
So what happened between 2009 and 2018 in regard to suicide-related diagnoses? This is quite striking. In the young adult and teen age group, in 2018, relative to 2009, the rate of suicide-related diagnoses went up anywhere from 3 to 4 times as high. Disease of despair diagnoses in general also went up, and you can see these ratios presented in the data. But these were really the striking data, and this is what got the headlines, that the rate of the prevalence of suicide-related diagnoses in young people had increased over this period of time, 9 years from 2009 to 2018, 3 to 4 times as high. That's really striking. And I think that when we start to look at the data on social media use, because as I said, the smartphone really seemed to take off in 2010, researchers have uncovered some very important correlations that we need to take note of if we're going to be oriented towards the ecology of growing up in the 21st century. Important correlations between social media use, depression, lowered self-esteem, and increased rates of loneliness. Now, it's important to understand that correlations in and of themselves do not equal causation. But what correlations can do is they can orient us to the ecology of the problem. What is the environment in which this problem is occurring like? What do we need to pay attention to in order to start to validate the challenges that young people are facing in the 21st century? And the modern irony to me, as I think about it, is that in a world that is more connected than ever before, in a world in which people carry this instant ability to connect with other people in their pocket everywhere they go, diagnoses of despair are on the rise. Diagnoses of despair and correlations to things like loneliness. How can it be that in a world that seems more connected than ever before, loneliness is a bigger problem? Suicide-related diagnoses have increased. How can this be? The question for the ecologist, I think, is how are the inputs related to the outputs? How is the ecology of the system modifying the inputs so that we get these outputs? Because I can't really come up with a logical connection. It seems to me that the world's more connected, and yet I'm seeing these effects. And again, correlation is not causation, but correlation really gets my attention, that's for sure. And I think it should get all of our attention. And I think a lot of you agree with me. These are the results of a survey that we sent out prior to this talk. And we got about 65 responses. Thank you very much for your responses, for your thoughtful responses. I think a lot of you are concerned, based on these responses, based on this sample, about the problems that the internet is causing, that it didn't cause when we were younger, when we were growing up. So it seems to me that we're on the same page in that regard. Now that's a 3-mile-high perspective. Looking at the ecology of the system, what kinds of correlations do we see? I want to zoom in for a moment and take a closer look at one particular disorder, borderline personality disorder. And this is a disorder that we're all quite familiar with, those of us who have gone through the Family Connections program. And I want to look at a very curious relationship. Again, looking at the ecology of the disorder from a closer perspective. We know that a great number of people who are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder engage in self-harming behaviors and engage in attempts to suicide. We also know, interestingly and confusingly, that very few of those, relatively few of those people, go on to actually complete suicide. How can this be? Again, I'm confused as to how the inputs are related to the outputs. In this case, the inputs being having a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, engaging in self-harm or attempting suicide, that's the input. The output being the completion of suicide. There's a disconnect here. And I'm not saying I'm unhappy with it. I'm grateful that very few people actually commit suicide, complete suicide. I'm grateful for that. And yet it raises an interesting question of what's going on here? How can we understand? We have a similar problem. We have the 3 Mile High problem, which is how can connectivity lead to increases in loneliness? And then we have this closer zoomed in view question of how do these inputs relate to these outputs? And it's very difficult to predict who's going to complete suicide. This is another problem that we have in the mental health world. In general, our predictive models aren't that helpful, aren't that good. And so we have this problem, not just in regard to suicide and borderline personality disorder, but in a lot of areas in the mental health world. And so the question is, how do we think about this? What kinds of systems are there? Well, on the one hand, we can say there are linear systems. A linear system is a system in which things are clearly related to other things. We always know the direction of cause and effect. Notice how in this system, the arrow always points in a definitive direction. And if I want to know which direction cause and effect is going, I just follow the arrow. So in a linear system, perhaps, let's just kind of come up with a concrete hypothetical example. Let's say a child comes home, Tommy comes home from school, and he failed an important exam. And Tommy's upset about it, so he tells his sister, Sally. But he says, don't tell mom or dad, because I know they're going to be really upset. Don't tell them. But then Sally's really kind of freaked out, like she's holding this secret. And she can't, at a certain point, she can't take it. So she goes and tells one of her parents. And then the parent is really upset because he or she knows how important this exam was for Tommy. Maybe he's trying to get into college. And so the parent gets upset and talks to Tommy. And Tommy experiences what the parent says as invalidating. Through no fault or intention of the parent, this is just how the child receives it. And then let's say the child, runs upstairs and slams their, bedroom door. Or we could imagine, a more dysregulated teen doing something more serious. And of course, we've all talked about that and we've all been there. In this system, who's at fault? Who's to blame? In linear systems, you always know who's to blame. You just look at who's at the end of your arrow. Tommy says Sally's to blame. He just looks to the end of his arrow. Sally says the parent's to blame. She just looks to the end of her arrow. The parent says that Tommy's to blame. The parent just looks to the end of their arrow. In linear systems, you always know which direction cause and effect is going, and you always know who to blame. Now, here's the thing. The transactional model of family connections is not a linear model. And I'm going to get to nonlinear models in a moment. But I just want you to notice these arrows are kind of going all over the place. Which direction are the arrows supposed to go? And the arrows feed back on each other. So it's a lot harder to track down cause and effect, or if you wish, blame, in the transactional model. And in fact, I want to peel the curtain back here, peel the onion a little bit. The reason is that the transactional model is a non-linear model. So we have linear systems where arrows have definite directions, and then we have non-linear systems. Take a look at the non-linear system. These arrows don't have a direction. They're going in both directions. They're going both ways. These arrows are going all over the place. Tommy might come home and talk to Sally. Sally might talk to the parent. The parent might talk to Tommy. But then, you know what? Sally might be saying things to Tommy. Tommy might be saying things to the parent. The teacher might be saying things to the parent and to Tommy and to Sally. The nonlinear system makes it very difficult for us to figure out which direction is cause and effect. In the nonlinear system, you don't know who to blame because your arrow doesn't have a direction. It's going both ways. This is very important. I want to spend some time talking about nonlinear systems, and I want to talk about them in a way that has now been explained and researched in the literature over and over again. And I think it's useful for us to pull back the curtain on this in the Family Connections program. Because I think that when Marsha Linehan came up with her transactional model, she was tossing a veritable intellectual bomb into the mental health world. She did it in such a way that I don't think people realized how incredibly radical it was. But I've been thinking about this, and it seems to me that what she was talking about is something that we have now come to describe as a complex adaptive system. Now, this is kind of complicated, but I'm going to walk through it here, and please ask questions along the way. A complex adaptive system is a system that is composed of interdependent agents that are acting in just their own local environment. They're trying to adapt to the demands of their local environment. So if we go back, we can see that Tommy and Sally are kind of trying to manage their relationship, and Tommy is trying to manage his relationship with his parent. And in this one little triad here, we can see how the three actors might be really only aware of that local set of interactions. But we know, because we're looking at the whole system, that the system is much bigger than that. And Tommy and Sally and the parent might not be aware of the influences that the teacher and the other parent are having on them. Because in that episode, when Tommy comes home and he's failed the exam and he's talking to his sister, and then the sister's talking to the parent, they're really only aware of that one local environment, that one limited, circumscribed episode. But the system is much bigger than that. And so what happens in complex systems is that people are just trying to adapt to their local environment, but the system as a whole is still having an impact. And the system as a whole is not the sum of its individual parts. Globally, one can observe effects that are not a linear product of each individual part of the system just adding up 1 + 1 = 2. The system as a whole exhibits a behavior. It's like it's one big organism, and it's got a mind of its own. And no one acting in their own little local environment has a blueprint or a master plan. It's really hard to see the whole system. What Tommy sees is that he told his sister. What the sister sees is that she's holding the secret. What the parent sees is that, oh my God, what's going to happen to college applications? It's very hard to see the big system. We need to work harder to see the system. That's what Family Connections and DBT challenges us to do. And that's what I want to help you do. So one thing that we can do with this idea of a complex system is that we can understand that complex systems are oftentimes very difficult to predict. We've talked about how, hey, these inputs aren't equaling these outputs. When we looked at it from the 3 Mile High perspective, we had this like, what's going on here moment. When we looked at one disorder, borderline personality disorder, we also saw inputs not equaling outputs. What's going on? This is really common with complex systems. They show these non-linear relationships. What happens oftentimes is that a complex system has the capacity, to absorb energy. Something will happen and the system will absorb the energy of that event, but the system won't show the change, won't show the effects. And complex systems can do that. They can absorb, I'm going to give you a concrete example of this in a moment. They can absorb energy for a while, and then they can change all of a sudden, very rapidly. And it looks like that last straw that broke the camel's back is what caused the change. And you're sitting there thinking, but that was such a small thing. How could it have caused such a big change? But it wasn't that last straw that broke the camel's back. It was the accumulation of a bunch of effects that weren't showing up on our radar. And then all of a sudden the system reacts. And another important thing to understand is that these changes are oftentimes not reversible. You can't unwind the tape and go back to home base. Because the system, why can't we do that? Because the system has now changed. It has a history, and that history can't be undone. And this is very important. We can't go back to the beginning. This is why we emphasize radical acceptance so much in family connections. And we say you can only change the future. You have to radically accept what has happened because you can't unwind the tape with a complex system. Okay, let's talk about some concrete examples because I don't want you to think that I'm just kind of pulling this out of thin air. Some of you may have seen on the news or heard, or I don't know, seen it on Google or somewhere, the Millennium Bridge in London. It was this new, beautiful bridge, took a lot of design. It had a very innovative design. It was a pedestrian bridge over the River Thames. It was meant to open, at the millennium to commemorate the millennium. It opens to a lot of fanfare. Within 48 hours, they had to shut it down. They had to shut it down because the bridge was swaying back and forth as people were walking on it. And they were worried people were going to get hurt. And they tried all kinds of things. They tried like limiting how many people could walk on the bridge. They had people lined up, blah, blah, blah. Nothing worked. They had to shut it down within 48 hours. What happened? Well, they brought in, because it wasn't doing this presumably during the testing, right? They tested it. People walked on the bridge while it was being built, no problem. They brought in researchers and they found out during researching the problem, it took a critical number of people to walk on the bridge to cause this effect. And they found out the number was, I think, about 160. When they were testing to figure out what happened, 100 people walking on the bridge, no problem. 110, 120, okay. Apparently you get to 160, and that's the point at which the bridge is now absorbing that amount of energy that causes this back and forth swaying motion. And there were a lot of fascinating theories about how it was, working, and I'm not going to go into all of that. You can read about that on the internet. That's an example of a complex adaptive system that absorbs energy to a certain point. Then you get to the point where you get the straw that breaks the camel's back, and the system just changes rapidly and unexpectedly. I don't think anyone expected this kind of back and forth. We've known about bridges that will go up and down when there are armies marching across them, and armies are taught to break step when they're marching across bridges. We knew about that kind of effect, but we didn't know about the back and forth, the swaying back and forth, the lateral motion. Here's another example of a complex adaptive system, a hive of ants. Hives of ants can do things that individual ants can't do. Individual ants, ant colonies forage for food, and they oftentimes will find the most effective and most efficient path to get to their food source. But that's not something that any individual ant knows. Individual ants are blind, like literally blind. They can't, there are lots of species of ants that are actually blind. Individual ants are just following pheromone trails. They're following the strongest pheromone trail left on the ground by the other ants. As a hive, as a colony, the ant colony can figure out with that method what's the most efficient way to get to a food source. So complex adaptive systems can do things that individual agents can't do within the system. And this is very important for us to remember. So these are just two examples of complex adaptive systems. Now you may be wondering, okay, what does this do for me? Like, this is all very interesting, but how is this useful? What's the advantage of learning to think from a systems perspective? Well, one aspect of systems, as I've highlighted, is they can be difficult to predict, which means that our automatic ideas about cause and effect might not be valid. And so the question is, ask yourself this: could whatever I'm upset about in this moment, or this week, or today, could whatever I'm upset about have happened in a completely different kind of world than I think we're living in? I may be driving down the freeway and someone cuts me off and I think, oh, that guy's always doing that. He's going to get into an accident. But no, wait a minute. Maybe the world is actually different than the way I think of it. Maybe this is the first time this person has ever done that in their life, and maybe this is the last time they're ever going to do that. Could the thing that I'm upset about have happened in a world that's completely different than I think it is? A world in which no one is to blame, a world in which no one is at fault, a world in which, in fact, the system has the mental illness, not a particular person or family. And this is what I ask people in my Family Connections program course workshop to think about. Who has the borderline personality disorder? Because from a systems perspective, it's not my mother, it's me. Actually, it's not me, it's the system, it's the family, it's the entire community. The entire community, the entire system could have the disorder, and my mother could still have been acting the way she was acting. My mother is my family member. I'm a consumer of the Family Connections program as well as a co-leader. And my mother, I'm pretty sure, had borderline personality disorder. Okay, but no, she didn't. The system had the disorder. From a systems perspective, this is how we have to think, or this is what's implied, at least. Dr. May was one of the early researchers in complex adaptive systems and how to come up with a mathematical model for them. And I love this quote because it gets at the essence of what we're talking about. Not only in research, but also in the everyday world, we would all be better off if we could realize that simple systems do not necessarily possess simple dynamical process properties. A system can look really simple. You might be saying to me, wait a minute, how can it be that like everyone can just kind of be doing their daily thing, and out of all that daily stuff comes this horrible disorder? You might be thinking, that's crazy. There has to be a more complicated, more sophisticated, more detailed explanation than that. Well, apparently not. Apparently, we can actually model simple systems that end up having really not simple, very dynamic properties. And this, I think, we really need to pay attention to. And the question is, can we come up with a model to predict mental health problems? Are our models doing a good job? Are our models too linear? And I think a lot of you are concerned about this. A lot of you share my concern. I'll just be blunt about my concern. I don't think we're doing a good enough job. I think we need to do a better job. And based on the survey responses, it seems like a lot of you are neutral and a lot of you are slanting towards disagree about our ability to predict mental health problems. So let's apply this systems model to the 21st century. How on earth did we get here? That's what I'd like to know. Presumably, at a certain point in time, the planet was born, and then humans showed up. Here's a human, an icon of a human, hopefully, it looks like one. And at a certain point, we invented technology. And at a certain point after that, the internet and the smartphone came along. And here's the thing, humans didn't come alone. Humans brought something with them, brought some friends with them. Humans brought their emotions. Humans brought their capacity for validation and invalidation. And what's really important, what we're going to talk about later, is humans brought this almost insatiable drive for group belonging. And I think these are two of the elements that when we talk about the system that we are living in the 21st century, we need to take this into consideration. How do these elements interact with this element? All of which is a relatively new invention when you look at the geographic, time scale of the life of the planet. Now, here's the thing. I've left out one important ingredient. Take a moment and see if you can guess what ingredient I left out. I need a drum roll here. Because I've left out, I also need an echo machine to make my voice echo here, the adolescent brain. The adolescent brain, I think, is a third element that we really need to take into consideration, and we're going to talk about this. Now, notice I've constructed a complex system here. The arrows are going in both directions. Granted, I don't have arrows going every which way, but at least I got arrows going in two directions. This, I want to propose, is a complex system that we need to think about as a complex system. And I want to break down each of these elements individually, but I want us to keep the idea of a complex system in mind, even as we start to break down these elements individually. So let's dive in. Okay, so what's an emotion? Well, an emotion is itself a complex system. In DBT and in family connections, we teach that emotions are complex systems composed of thoughts, composed of feelings, composed of changes that your body might experience, like your heart rate and how fast you're breathing, composed of things you might do, actions and urges to action. So emotions are themselves complex systems. Isn't that interesting? And how do emotions work? Well, here's how emotions work. One function of an emotion is to communicate, but another function of an emotion is to get you responding to a situation, get you working on a problem. If I'm standing on the street corner and a car is coming towards me, my emotion of fear gets me moving out of the way. How does that work? Well, at a certain point, something happens. We can imagine that something happens here at the beginning of the graph, and we're graphing emotional intensity against performance. How good is our performance? As we go up the graph, our performance gets better. As we go along the x-axis, our emotional intensity gets higher. Our emotions get going. We start to get better. Our performance starts to increase. We're in the green zone. We're just kind of getting going. At a certain point, oh, look at that. We've reached a zone of optimal performance. We're doing a good job. We're in the zone, as people say, because our emotions have gotten to the point where we're performing adequately to try and solve the problem. And so our emotions increase in intensity. Our emotions are going up and up. The performance is going up and up. Great, everybody's having a good day. Whoa, wait a minute. What happened here? Our emotions went too high. We got to the point where now performance is starting to go down. We're in the red zone. And this is how emotions work. Emotions will increase to a point of optimal performance, and then as they continue to increase, our performance drops off, and especially our performance for complex tasks involving memory and attention and cognitive processing, logic, all of those things tend to really drop off when we get past this point of optimal performance. And that's the way emotions work. I want to say thank you to Dr. Alan Frusetti, who reminded me of these relationships in an email. I was actually going to quote his email, but then I decided I've got too much text in my presentation. I need a picture. But I'm going to give credit to Dr. Alan Frusetti for reminding me of this. Thank you very much. Okay, so that's emotions. Okay, so we're talking about emotions. We're talking about validation, we're talking about group belonging, and we're talking about the adolescent brain. That's what we got from that slide that went from the earth across to the smartphone, just to remind you. So we've talked about emotions. Let's talk about validation. We all know what validation is. We're going to talk about it a little bit more in depth later on, just to remind you. But the effect of validation, why we use validation in family connections, is that emotions don't run as high. That's the effect of validation. The effect of validation is it gets you going from the red zone back to the blue zone. That's why we like validation. People also listen more and share more when you validate. That's how you know you validated. If people are talking more and listening to you, you probably did something that was validating. Trust will increase, relationships will improve. And remember, we're back in the blue zone. This is where we're good at solving problems. So when we validate, we're better at solving problems. That's what happens when we validate. Yay, validation. What happens when we invalidate? Well, all the opposites of all of that. And here's the real kicker. People will learn to escalate their behaviors to get their needs met. That's a real problem with invalidation, is that over time, people will learn. Because the thing is, oftentimes when people get to a certain point in escalation of their behavior and inaccurate expressions, what Dr. Frusetti calls inaccurate expressions, people will then start to pay attention to them and give them the validation that they actually need. And what that teaches, that cycle, is that it teaches people that the only way to get my needs met, gotta ramp it up, gotta escalate my behaviors. So here's the question, why? Why are validation and invalidation so incredibly potent? Why do they get us going from the blue zone to the red zone? If someone's in the blue zone and you invalidate them, they may end up in the red zone. And why can we get people going back from the red zone to the blue zone when we validate? Why are they so potent? Well, to answer that question, we have to talk about signaling functions. What's a signaling function? A signaling function is easy to understand. If you're walking up to a dog on the street and that dog doesn't want to have anything to do with you, that dog might growl and bare its teeth. And if you keep getting closer, it might bite you. But here's the thing. Most of the time, people will understand that when a dog is growling and baring its teeth, you shouldn't get any closer. So the growling and the baring of the teeth, it's a signaling function. It's an indirect method of communicating. If you get close enough, the dog will probably be like, fine, I'll use the direct method. You didn't get the indirect method. Okay, here's a bite. Now get away from me. But most of the time, I think signaling functions do work. When the dog growls, you get the message, and they don't need to use the direct method. They can use the indirect method, which is the signaling function. So that's what a signaling function is. Signaling functions are not always obvious. We as humans are incredibly sensitive to very, very, very subtle signaling functions. And I don't think I entirely appreciated this until I read this book by N.J. Enfield this book has a lot of data on how we pick up on really subtle signals, and I'll leave you to read the book. It was written for a general audience. I think it's fascinating. Suffice it to say that we oftentimes send and receive very subtle signaling messages about validation and invalidation. And what's going on there? What does validation signal that gets us calmed down, and what does invalidation signal that gets us so upset? Well, I think my hypothesis is that it's signaling cooperation and it's signaling group belonging. And so this is where we get to one of those elements in that diagram about group belonging and our drive for group belonging. We know that emotions evolved. One of the evolutionary functions of an emotion is to communicate. If someone acknowledges your need that you communicate, they're signaling that they might attend to those needs. Imagine a child saying they're hungry. Mommy, mommy, I'm hungry. The child might be very anxious. The parent hears the anxiety expressed in the voice. They hear what the child is saying. The parent says, okay, no problem. We're going to have dinner soon. 15 minutes, whatever. The child is calmed. In this scenario, the emotion served a useful function. And validation signaled that the emotion was serving a useful function. So there was a cooperation that ensued. The child expressed an emotion, and the parent processed that and signaled they had processed that and signaled cooperation. And furthermore, I think they also signaled, hey, you're part of my group. Because I care about you, because you're part of my family, because we're living under the same house, I'm validating you. I'm recognizing your needs. And I'm signaling that I processed your emotional expression. So I think one of the reasons that validation and invalidation are so powerful is that they have come to signal over evolutionary time, cooperation and group belonging. And when we hear validation, we think, or we feel, it's probably more of a felt sense, we feel part of the group. When we experience invalidation, we feel, oh, not part of the group. What happens when you're not part of the group? Competition, aggression. What happens when you're part of the group? Cooperation, access to resources. And speaking of resources, I think we can also think of validation as a resource, as a social resource that we all need. Because remember, validation, what does it do? It takes you from the red zone to the blue zone. If a child's having trouble doing their homework or their schoolwork and they're really upset and they go to their teacher, and the teacher validates them, and then the student can go back and finish their schoolwork and do well in school, what has that student gotten access to? A social resource. So I think that not only does validation signal something, I think it's actually a resource. When we validate each other, we help each other get better at problem solving, and then we do better. And we know that resources tend to get bestowed on people that we see as part of our group. That's almost the definition of an in-group, is the group upon which you bestow valued resources. And so I think it's intimately related to this question of who belongs here, who's in the group, who's in the in-group, and who's in the out-group. And so the question is, if this is indeed a social resource, what would someone do to get it? What would someone do to get access to this social resource? Now, the question also arises, are we just naturally cooperative? Can we somehow depend on our evolution as naturally cooperative beings to kind of solve the problem for us? And I think the answer at times is both yes and no. And based on the survey response, some of you are neutral and some of you are slanting towards agreeing. We are naturally cooperative. And I agree with that. And I also think that the flip side is that we are also naturally competitive. And I think that's where we oftentimes get into trouble on the internet and with this whole social media thing. So let's move on. Because here's where we need to start talking about the adolescent brain. The adolescent brain is going through a major change. There is a major reorganization going on to the part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, the PFC. The prefrontal cortex is this part of your brain that sits in the front of your brain. It sits right above your eyes. It can be thought of, I think of it as the CEO, the chief executive officer of the brain. It's the part of the brain that helps people follow rules and set priorities and goals, inhibit impulses, and balance emotions with reason and logic. And it's, one of my supervisors and I used to say jokingly, but I think it's accurate. In adolescence, the prefrontal cortex is down for renovation. And what we know about adolescents, interestingly, it's not entirely clear whether adolescents are more impulsive, but some of the data seem to indicate that they are actually more risk-seeking and that is distinct from being impulsive. That adolescents are very strongly biased towards seeking rewards and taking risks, going out there into the world, which is their developmental task, going out into the world and trying new things. And that makes sense from a developmental standpoint. The adolescent brain is also certainly strongly biased by emotions. It's oftentimes in emotion mind. If the prefrontal cortex is down for renovation, the emotional part of the brain can't get as much modulation from the prefrontal cortex. People are going to be in emotion mind. And this is why people are in emotion mind more when they're drinking, because alcohol also shuts down that part of the brain. And I think adolescents, we have to take into account this critical feature of the adolescent brain, that it is strongly biased. That means it pays very close attention to in-group and out-group alliances, to questions of who belongs here, who's part of the in-group and who's part of the out-group, who's on the outside. Related to this is the question of relative deprivation, and I think this is also critical on the internet and on social media. Now, this is not a new idea. This is an idea that cropped up in the work of Samuel Stauffer, who was a sociologist who studied the sociology of the US military in the war years and in the post-war years. And he found something very interesting. And I mean, he published his work in more volumes than I can count. But one of the findings that he discovered, he was looking at, are soldiers in the US military happy with the promotional system? This was something that the military wanted to know. They wanted to know, are the people fighting for us, are the people in our military happy with the system we've put in place for promoting them? And he found something very interesting. He found two branches of the military, one that had high rates of promotion and one that had low rates of promotion. And he asked the question of the soldiers, are you happy with the promotional system? And guess what? You would think that the people who were in the high promotional rate system would be the happiest, but no. Those soldiers, those military staff who were in the part of the military that had high rates of promotion were actually the least satisfied with the promotional system. And out of this work came the idea of relative deprivation. Even though they were in a condition where they actually objectively had more of this good promotion, they were actually less happy with it. They experienced relative deprivation. It wasn't absolute deprivation because they actually had higher rates of promotion. But because, and they had some very interesting ideas about how this worked, because of their perception of their surroundings, they perceived themselves as having less, even though they actually had more. And this concept has now been studied. I mean, this is where it began in 1949. It has now been studied and debated, and I'm sure there's lots of controversy, but it's relevant to social media. So the definition of relative deprivation is that it occurs when someone is denied an outcome to which they believe they are entitled. In the research literature on social media, it's been characterized, it's been called the fear of missing out, a pervasive apprehension that others might be having a rewarding experience from which one is absent. And this, I think, is critical because the child who has everything, shelter, food, warm bed to sleep in, running water, what have you, school to go to, if they have become caught up in this fear of missing out on the internet, they may be experiencing a condition of relative deprivation. And that can have a profound impact on people's mood. It can distort people's perceptions. Remember, those people who were in the branch of the military that had higher rates of promotion actually had more of that social resource, but they didn't see it. The relative deprivation got in the way of their perception of the reality. So relative deprivation can distort our view of the actual reality. And the question is, what would a teen do? A teen whose prefrontal cortex is down for renovation, a teen who's extremely sensitive to in-groups and out-groups and risks and rewards. What would a teen do to feel like they're part of the in-group? To feel like they can escape a painful emotional experience? What would a teen do to get validation, to get their needs recognized? What would a teen do in an emotion mind moment? Remember, they're in emotion mind a lot of the time. What would a teen do in an emotion mind moment, trying to escape a painful emotional experience, trying to feel like they were part of the in-group, trying to overcome this sense of relative deprivation? What might they do that they might regret later on? And I think all of these factors come together to help explain and help us understand this phenomenon that has now been researched called social media or internet addiction. It hasn't made its way into the DSM, which is the handbook of the official handbook of psychiatric disorders, but it's certainly in the research. And one of the things I want to do today is, for those of you who have been worried about this, I want to validate you. I want to validate you on the basis of the research. I can't validate you on what's going on with the DSM, but I certainly can validate you in terms of there's lots of researchers concerned about this, and a lot of you are concerned about this. We've got strongly agrees and we've got agrees predominantly in this survey question that the concept of the social media addiction makes sense to me. And so the question is, what can we do? Well, first of all, we can take the problem seriously, and we can be dialectical. We don't want to exaggerate it. We don't want to dismiss it. So let's go over some family connections skills. My goal here is to explain my understanding of family connections, not to tell you what to do or give advice. I think that we can summarize the family connections perspective on power is that power in relationships tracks with the 4 C's: being consistent, showing concern, being connected, and having courage. Now notice what's not on the list: coercion. Coercion is not one of the C's on this list. Coercion, AKA brute force. That is not what my understanding of family connections is. Dialectical relationships and family connections, from my perspective, are based on 2 things. It's a dialectic: having clear and consistent expectations on the one hand, and an awareness of our limits, and showing consistent care, concern, love, compassion, and warmth. Those 2 things can exist at the same time. Yes, they can. And if you want to look to the research for validation, this is basically what people are talking about when they research the authoritative parenting style. This is what the authoritative parenting style is: having clear structure and having warmth and love. Now, the question arises, why should we observe limits? Well, one reason we should observe limits is they exist whether we want them to or not. And I don't know why that is. It just seems to be that we live in a world, the ecology of the world we live in is that ignoring limits doesn't make them go away. But ignoring limits does tend to hurt relationships because it damages our self-respect and increases resentment. And we oftentimes want to avoid the person who's crossing our limits. Here's another painful fact about limits, is that we sometimes don't know about them till they're crossed. Now, this can be painful and useful because when someone crosses my limit, then I learn about it. Then it's like, oh, I didn't know I really hated being called that word. I won't say the word. But wow, someone called me that word, and now I know I don't like being called that word. Okay, that was painful, and I learned something. So I would invite you all to spend some time taking an inventory, doing your own limits inventory. And it can start out with some simple questions. What time of day are you most generous? Oh, that's interesting. I never thought about that. What time of day am I least generous? What makes me feel connected? What makes me feel disconnected? What's negotiable? You can start your own observing limits inventory, and you might find it's useful. Please let us know. I'd be curious. I think that if we start to observe limits, we know that role modeling is a really powerful concept, especially in family connections. And if you start to pay attention to your limits, you might find that it opens up a conversation with your child about their limits, because they might have noticed, wow, I really don't like it when I go on my phone and then I wake up 2 hours or 3 hours later and I've been on YouTube and all these social media sites wasting time for 2 hours. I don't like that. You might have a child or a teen who's been thinking that to themselves, noticing this limit, but hasn't really been able to articulate it. Wouldn't it be great to have that kind of conversation? Because it leads to the next conversation, which is the conversation about values, because the flip side of a limit is a value. For example, what's your idea of family? You may be noticing, wow, I really hate it when we're trying to have dinner as a family and everybody's on their phone. That's really crossing my limits. Wow, it looks like one of my values is that people sit down to dinner as a family and they talk to each other. This reminds me, I was in a cafe and I looked up and I saw this sign on the wall and I loved it. And it said, no, we don't have Wi-Fi. Pretend it's 1992. Talk to each other. So limits, the flip side of a limit is that you might find out about a value. What's your idea of family? What do you want your children to learn from you? Values in action, I think, can be a really useful way to bring the family back together. It's entirely possible that one of your values is to contribute to the community. I certainly have that value. That's why I'm here now. Is it also important for you that your family contribute to the community? Is this a value that you want to pursue with your family? Or on the other hand, is it a value in your family, from your perspective, that everyone in the home contribute to the health of the family? And is one way of contributing to the health of the family to share in the preparation and enjoyment of meals together? That's another value. And then the question is, how do smartphones come into that? What is the role of a smartphone? It's entirely possible that smartphones might facilitate some of those values. I'm open to that possibility. I'm also open to the possibility that the smartphone might get in the way. The point is that if you start to orient towards limits and values, it might lead you to a point of realizing, oh, this is how a smartphone is consistent, and this is how a smartphone is inconsistent. Okay, so we've talked about observing limits. We've talked about the adolescent brain. Now I want to talk more about validation. The reason I want to talk about validation is that I suspect a lot of what teens are experiencing on the internet is highly invalidating. And in family connections, I think I'm correct in saying that we think that the antidote to invalidation is validation. So let's talk about validation. According to Marsha Linehan, and I think she knows, validation communicates in a non-ambiguous way that behavior makes sense and is understandable in the current context. Now, I want to highlight this word non-ambiguous. This is hugely important because if you're validating just to get on to the next thing that you want to talk about, that's really ambiguous. That's not what Marsha is talking about. Marsha is talking about letting go of everything else except the validation. Because in order to be experienced as genuine and truly validating, it's got to be non-ambiguous. You've got to throw yourself into it. And that's not easy to do. I will validate that that's not easy to do. I will validate I'm asking you to do something difficult, and I'm still going to ask you to do it. Because here's the thing, the functions of validation, I think, are incredibly important to teens at this age. Validation gets you approaching. Validation gets you recognizing. Validation gets you paying attention and acknowledging. Validation gets you appreciating the depth of people's emotions. If someone's shouting and yelling, they might look angry, but they might be feeling really sad. Not everyone who yells is angry. Some people yell when they're sad. Some people yell when they're afraid. And we can appreciate the depth of that if we can validate. That's where validation takes us. We can perceive the rationality of a behavior. Think back to that triad. Tommy tells Sally, Sally tells the parent, parent says something to Tommy. We can understand the rationality. Like Tommy, he's just worried, like, what am I going to do? I failed this exam. My parents are going to be really angry. Who do I tell? Oh, Sally, I can tell Sally. She's on my side. Sally is overcome with guilt and fear and anxiety. What do? I can't hold the secret. I have to tell my parent. The parent is overcome with anxiety. How's Tommy going to get into a college, or what's going to happen? We can perceive the rationality of everybody's behavior in that chain of events if we validate. And we can start to understand how we might behave in the same way. Like, who can't connect to that story? I sure can. There were plenty of times when I did something that I was really worried about. I made a mistake and I didn't know who to tell. Who do I tell? Who's going to get angry at me? And I can imagine most parents could validate the concern that that parent in that hypothetical scenario might have felt about their child. So we can affirm common ground through validation. And most importantly, I think this is level 6 validation, according to Marsha Linehan, is that when we respect people's autonomy, we approach them with this dialectic of respecting their autonomy and committing to staying involved. And there's a deep affirmation of people's competence and their personhood in that. And that, I think, is a form of validation that I think was probably unique to DBT when it came on the scene. And now as DBT has been disseminated, it's become more common. Here's the thing. You may be thinking, oh, well, validation means I just have to make them feel good, or I just have to do whatever they want. No, that is not validation. Validation is not agreement. It is not appeasement. It is not praise. It is not reassurance. Now, I'm not telling you that you shouldn't agree. I'm not telling you you shouldn't appease. I'm not telling you you shouldn't praise. And I'm not telling you you shouldn't reassure. I'm not saying you should avoid those things. I'm just saying none of those things is validation. And you don't have to do any of those things in order to validate. That's very important. You can validate without doing any of those things. Validation does include being clear. It involves being precise about what can be validated and what can't be validated, because there are things we can't validate. If someone calls me a certain word that's very judgmental, I can't validate that because I don't even really know what that is. It's like really imprecise. It means different things to different people. If someone calls me a whatever, it's just not precise. So I can't validate it. But if someone were to say to me, hey, I'm really angry at you, that's very precise. I can validate that. Validation is empathic. Validation makes sense of the other person's experience. Validation is not sympathy. Sympathy is you sit back and you say, oh yeah, it's a rough day. Well, at least you have your health. That's sympathy. That's not validation. That's not empathy. Empathy is, it looks like you're having a horrible day. I'm so glad you came and talked to me about it. Because if you're having a horrible day, you're someone I care about, that means I'm going to be concerned. Validation is not judgmental. Validation requires you to be non-judgmental. It requires you to be open to the fact that there may be more than one way to validate someone, and it's important to keep working at it. And validation, more than anything else, is a strategy. It's not about the truth. It's about what goals do I want to achieve. Okay, so we've talked about emotions, we've talked about validation. Now let's talk about problem solving, because some of you may be facing a big problem. What do I do about the smartphone in my child's life? That could be a big problem, especially if you're worried about these concerns of internet addiction. And I'm going to validate those concerns. There's a lot of researchers out there in the world who are going to validate those concerns. And I also want to remind you that at a certain point, you may need to make the decision to consult a professional. And if you think you're dealing with a true addiction, a mental health problem, a situation where someone's safety is at risk, consult a professional. Don't try and do it on your own. That's very important. But let's go back to the Family Connections program. What is the Family Connections model? What is problem solving in a Family Connections world? Remember that to solve a problem, you can't do it on your own. As I've just said, you can't do it on your own. You need a relationship. Problems are solved dialectically. That means there's two people at least involved. Remember, we're dealing with these complex systems. They're bigger than any one of us. And these systems act in a way that is hard to predict. You need to recruit parts of the system in order to be effective in this kind of system. In the linear system, yeah, no problem. You can do it all on your own because we know which direction cause and effect goes in a linear system. All you have to do is change your behaviors, and then cause and effect goes in one direction, and then Sally's going to be fine if Tommy changes his behavior, and then Sally's going to be fine, and then the parent's going to be fine. That's a linear system, but that's not what we're working with.
Excuse me, Saul.
Yeah.
Can you explain what before we get into problem solving, can you identify like when you think it crosses over into a problem or a disorder or an addiction? Because some parents, it comes back to values. They may think that their child should, or whoever it may be, we may have spouses or siblings or something, shouldn't be on their phone or sitting on the computer, but that just may be their value, which is fairly normative for someone else. So when do you think that it crosses over?
Well, first of all, I want you to validate your own feelings and thoughts. If you're thinking this is crossed over, I want you to take that very, very, very seriously. And so that's my first response there, is if you're having the thought, this has crossed a line, I want you to pay attention to that thought. And I think it's entirely valid to call a professional and say, hey, I'm not ready to bring my kid into your office, but can I come into your office to talk about this? Because I've been having this thought for a couple of weeks now that it's crossed a line and I need to talk to someone about it. I need to talk to a professional. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that, an overall gestalt of addictions is basically, I think we all intuitively kind of have an idea. It's a behavior that someone's not stopping. It's a compulsion. Maybe a synonym for addiction is compulsion. Maybe we don't have to talk about social media addiction. Maybe we can talk about social media compulsion. To what extent does someone appear compelled to do something? And is that compulsion getting in the way of doing something else? Have you observed that? Because let's validate, if you're having the thought, this has crossed the line, like you're not just pulling that thought out of nowhere. People don't just have that thought for the fun of it. People have that thought because something has happened. So orient yourself, ask yourself, what has happened for me to have that thought that this has crossed the line? And then you'll have something concrete to talk about when you call the professional for the appointment. I would love to get into that more in depth. That could be the topic of an entire workshop on its own. So I hope that what I've said there is helpful, but I do want to validate how important that question is. So thank you very much for asking that question. Okay, so remembering that problem solving is a dialectical process, and remembering that one of the dialectics is that sometimes we can solve the problem and sometimes we can't. That in itself is a dialectic. Oh, today I could solve the problem, but I remember that yesterday I couldn't solve the problem. Sometimes problems have to be managed. And choosing to manage a problem doesn't mean that you've given up on the problem. Far from it. Management is the opposite of giving up. It means that you're actually observing a limit. Yay, you're using another skill. Because sometimes there are temporary limits that get in the way of problem solving. And in that case, it's skillful to manage them. And it means that you value the relationship. It means that you haven't given up. It means that you are sticking with the relationship to get yourself and the other person to the point where you can solve the problem. That's what problem management is about. So problem solving and problem management are two sides of the same coin, and neither one of them means giving up. One dialectic that I think is very useful to pay attention to in problem solving, notice that problem solving in the family connections world is very dialectical. So what's an important dialectic? Well, one important dialectic is, how strong is my ask? Is this a hill I'm ready to die on, as they say? Am I going into this problem-solving meeting with this other person? Am I planning to hint at what I want, and am I willing to accept no? Or am I going into this conversation planning to be completely clear about what I want, and it's a hill I'm ready to die on? I'm willing to pay any price. Understanding where you're at in that dialectic, I think, can be very useful. And ask yourself this question: where's the other person in regard to those? Are they going to hint at no, and are they willing to say yes? Or are they completely clear about saying no, and that's the hill they're going to die on? What's at stake for the other person? I think that's another important part of the dialectic to be very clear on in your own mind. You may not have it right, but I think it's important and skillful to give that some thought before you approach someone about problem solving. Now, here's another interesting dialectic about problem solving. People will oftentimes come to a problem solving session having already decided what the solution is. Let me give you an example of that. Sally, this time it's Sally. Sally comes home and says to her mother, "I hate Sarah. I'm never talking to her ever again. She's not my friend. I'm defriending her on Facebook." What has Sally just done? Clearly, Sally is facing a problem. Sally has come home and proposed a solution. Sally has come home and announced to her mother, this is the solution. The solution to my problem is to defriend Sarah. Sally's mother may have a very different solution in mind. Sally's mother may want to say, oh, no, you're not. You are not defriending Sarah again for the 4th time this month, because then I'm going to have to listen to you for the next week, worrying about what's the consequence of defriending Sarah, who's been your best friend since kindergarten. That might be the thing that's running through the parent's mind. Now notice how the parent now has come up with their solution. Sally's solution is defriending. Parent's solution is no defriending. What have we lost track of in this dialectic? We have lost track of the fact that nobody's talking about their concerns. And so one way to be dialectical in problem solving is to make sure that if someone proposes a solution, you try to redirect the conversation to a concern. You don't just come out with a solution to match a solution just because they led with a solution. You don't have to respond solution for solution. You can redirect the conversation to a concern, and you can say, oh, sounds like you're mad at Sarah. What's up? Can we talk about your concerns? Can you validate my concerns? Can we have a really fruitful, dialectical, mindful conversation about concerns before we move to solutions? And during that conversation, can we work hard and use our skills to observe and describe, to express our feelings about our concerns, to ask our ask or assert our perspectives, and to reward the other person for taking you seriously, for validating you, and for making an effort to engage in this problem-solving conversation. These are the Dear Man skills. D for describe, E for express, A for ask, R for reward. And along the way, can we use our MAN skills, being mindful, assertive, and being willing to negotiate? Well, what does that involve? Well, I think being mindful oftentimes involves having a goal and a plan. If the problem that you're facing is, people being on their smartphones during dinner, what's the goal and then what's the plan? Having a goal and a plan and discussing it with people you trust is a mindfulness practice. And behavioral psychologists, clinical psychologists in the behavioral tradition talk about make your plan and your goal a SMART goal. When it's smart, meaning it's specific, it's measurable, it's achievable, it's rewardable, and it's time limited. If I sit down after the end of my limits and values inventory and I say to myself, I want us to be a better family, that's not a SMART goal. It's not specific, measurable, achievable, rewardable, and time limited. A SMART goal is, I want us to do 5 hours of volunteer work as a family every month. That is very specific. It's very time limited. It's not linked to, I want to build an entire city or I want to solve world poverty. It's time limited and it's achievable because it's time limited. I want us to do 5 hours of volunteer work as a family every month, and it's measurable. That's what we call a SMART goal. And it's a mindfulness practice, and it might be useful in problem solving. Mindfulness in problem solving also means you don't always have to have the answer. In fact, bad news, good news, you won't always have the answer. I can predict that with a fair degree of statistical probability. You won't always have the answer. And one of my favorite mindfulness phrases, which I learned when someone crossed my limits, this happened to me when I was in a program where one of my supervisors was continually acting in a way that I found very invalidating. And I didn't know what to do about it because it oftentimes happened in group settings in front of my colleagues, and I was just very confused, and I was very angry and frustrated and anxious. And I finally said to myself, okay, this is what I'm going to say. Whenever she says something or asks a question that I find very invalidating, I'm going to say, good question. Let me give it some thought and get back to you. And that really seemed to work. That really seemed to work to both validate and observe my limits. And it seemed to communicate enough connection to her that she didn't feel like she was being dismissed. And then the emotion came down. And so I think it's useful for us to validate that we're not always going to have the perfect answer. And what are we going to say when we don't have the perfect answer? This is just my phrase. You might want to come up with your own phrases of, what do I say when I've proposed that we need to do something about this smartphone problem, and then like I get this storm of emotion and all these questions being thrown at me, and I don't have the answers. Mindfulness means we're ready for that. We know we don't have the answers. It's okay. We have a response. You have a, I don't have the answer, perhaps. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about systems and complex systems. We've talked about the internet. We've talked about the possibility of compulsive behaviors and addiction. We've talked about relative deprivation. We've talked about this question of what would a teen do to get a sense of belonging or to overcome this feeling of relative deprivation? How many lengths would they go to achieve that? And what does that lead to? What does that look like? I want to sum up by coming back to this idea of a system and what a system does, because I think this is very important for how we move forward. Remember that I said that a system will oftentimes absorb energy in a way that isn't entirely visible. And it will do that for a period of time, like the bridge, like the Millennium Bridge. One person walks on it, 2 people walk on it, 50 people, 100 people, everything's fine. 160, whammo, it starts doing this. And systems can undergo these rapid, unexpected changes. And systems are difficult. They are difficult to change. And sometimes they require interventions at the systems level. And I have read authors writing about this problem of social media on teens who have suggested that some of our solutions may need to come at the systems level. One of the researchers highlighted the fact that apparently in France, I wasn't aware of this, apparently in France, some schools have said, you can't have your smartphone in school. Oh my God. How did they do that? It's like magic. Like, what did they have, like a Harry Potter spell, like the Expelliarmus, and all the smartphones just kind of fly out of the school? I don't know. How did they do that? I was amazed when I read this, but I believe in the researcher. And I validate that, yes, some of these solutions may need to come at the systems level, via schools or communities or parent groups at the level of the city or the county. I don't know. But here's the thing about systems. Because we know they absorb energy in ways that we can't always see, nothing is neutral. Nothing's ineffective. Everything has an effect. That's just one of the laws of physics. Energy is neither created nor destroyed. That's the conservation of energy. And when you do something, when you put energy into a system, it goes somewhere. It has an effect. You may not see the effect until you get to that 160 magic number, the straw that breaks the camel's back, or the straw that fixes the camel's back. But be aware of the fact that nothing is neutral. And many human cultures, I would venture to say perhaps most human cultures, have this idea. Like, this is not a new idea. For thousands of years, as far as we can look back in the written record, we've been talking about this idea of universality, of our place within a larger system. And many human cultures have promoted the idea that what we do on a small scale has a profound impact. It's been called karma. Now, the word karma does not mean fate. The word karma means action. What are you doing? What are you doing that's having an effect on the larger system? That's what karma means. But there are other words in other cultures, and I think that when we use words like virtue and morality, this is what we're getting at. We're getting at this idea that although we are acting on a small scale, what we do has a profound impact upon the world. And so I want to leave you with a quote by I would say she's my favorite classical pianist, Katya Bunyatishvili. I hope I said that right. This was something that she wrote as part of her notes for one of her recordings that came out in 2019, about a year before the pandemic hit us. The struggle was not in vain. It did not make us happier, but it was right. Perhaps those that follow will follow the same path as us, but better than we did. And the aim is not to arrive first, but to walk together. Thank you very much. And I think we have time for questions.
We do. Thank you so much, Saul. That was wonderful. Okay, let's see. Do you mind? We're going to stop share screen, if that's okay. There we go. All right, perfect. So we have a question, Saul. I can imagine that because of the pandemic, so many kids, their smartphone was their connection to the outside world.
Right.
So, and I can also imagine the fear of missing out is fueled by this phone. So let's say a parent of a teen, they see that the phone is a connection to the outside world, and they also see the problem that it's creating.
Right.
So where do you start on those limits and validation? Like I said, I can imagine parents are like, what do I do? I get it, and I don't know what to do.
Right.
So, starting point.
Right. It's a total dialectic because, of course, absolutely throughout the pandemic, I mean, we have to acknowledge the elephant in the room. Here we are on social media, talking about social media, right? And most of the research I did for this talk on social media was done on the internet. Go figure. So I do not want people to walk away from this talk with the message that the internet is evil or that the smartphone is evil. I also don't want people to walk away from the sense that, we haven't seen this before. I mean, these questions have been important questions for adolescents for as long as there's been adolescence, I would imagine. But the internet has really amplified things. And I think the internet has created this environment where people are, I think it is really the relative deprivation. And the fact that it's being carried around with them 24/7, and the fact that people are chasing these likes and feeling so horrible about themselves when they don't feel like they got enough likes or they didn't get as many likes as their next door neighbor. That's the relative deprivation kicking in. And we've faced this, this is not a new issue, but it is being amplified. And so where do you start? So the question is, where do you start? Well, I think first you start by very precisely describing what is and what is not a problem here. Because researchers have, the researcher who did the research on loneliness and who suggested that we may need to make some changes at the school level, she pointed out that some smartphone use might actually be beneficial, that some smartphone use at a certain level might actually be protective. And so it makes sense that this connectivity that we get through the smartphone might actually, we are inherently a cooperative species, I think. Where we get into trouble is when it hooks into our competitive nature. So the question is, what exactly is the problem here? When and how are they crossing the line? Is it that they're on the phone during dinner? Is it they're on the phone in the middle of the night? Is it that they're chasing the likes? Is it that they have started to distort their view of themselves and their reality because of the relative deprivation? They suddenly think they've got nothing in the world. There's a big difference between someone who sends out a blurb about what they had for breakfast and then goes about their day and never thinks about it again, versus someone who spends 10 hours preparing the perfect picture of themselves and uses all of these digital methods to change their appearance and then posts it and then checks it every 10 minutes to see how many likes they've gotten. Those are two totally different uses of the internet. So I think we need to pay attention to that.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you. Doreen, is there a question in the Q&A?
Yeah. There was someone that asked, I think when you did the SMART, that the R was rewardable, but they had previously learned that the R was realistic. And they asked that you give a concrete example, please.
Sure. I think it can be either one. Achievable, A could also be for achievable. A concrete example, so something that's realistic, which oftentimes makes it rewardable. Well, I guess that depends on where your child is at, because I think for some children, it is realistic to give up their phone during dinner, and perhaps others it is not. And so I think you have to be very much in tune with where your child is at and how much they are attached to this device. For some children, giving it up for an hour a day may be no sweat. And for other children, it may be the emotional equivalent of running a marathon. And so what's realistic, and hence what's rewardable, really depends on where you think you're at. And I apologize for making that a bit of an evasive answer, but let's just validate that many of these questions, one of my favorite teachers used to say his graduate students quickly learned that the answer to any of his questions is, it depends. And it's true, it depends on the functional situation in many cases. But it's important to ask yourself the question, is this realistic for my child to achieve? Because we want someone to achieve something, because we want someone to be rewarded. That's why realistic and rewardable are linked, the two R's. Because if they can't achieve something, they can't be rewarded for it. And we want people to be oriented towards a rewards-based program. We know that rewards-based programs tend to be more effective than punishment-based programs. And that's why it's so important for us to at least ask the question, can my child achieve this realistically? Can they get the reward? Because we don't, the consequence of not achieving it and not getting the reward is demoralization. But I don't remember demoralization being anywhere in the Family Connections program. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember it being there.
We have a question, which I think is a really good one. There's a lot of danger on the internet, and how can we help our teens understand that there is a need for limit setting, and it is for their own protection?
Right. Great question. Super important question. We should absolutely not fall prey to what I've heard called the NMK, the not my child or not my kid syndrome. We should absolutely understand that there are dangers out there and that everyone is subject to them and no one is immune potentially. And I think the answer to the question is, first of all, when we start to observe our limits, we can role model observing limits for other people. Secondly, it gives us a chance to have a conversation with people about, where are you at with this? What kinds of horrible stories have you heard? Because if it hasn't happened to your kid, it's probably happened to someone that your kid knows. They've probably heard the stories. And if it hasn't happened to someone they know, they've probably read the stories on the internet. And so the question is, for them, how do you open up the conversation about, where are you at with this? What are your thoughts and feelings about this? It starts with validation. And the validation, my hope, is that it would open up a conversation that can lead to, okay, this is how you keep yourself safe. But we have to kind of get there with them. Remember, that power in relationships is those 4 C's: concern, consistency, but not coercion. We're not going to get there if we just come at them and say, it's a horrible world, you have to be careful. Like, I mean, maybe that'll work for some people, you know, but I think for a lot of people, we're going to have to get there with them. If that makes sense.
The other challenge, Saul, is this person was asking, it's not just about danger, like predators and things like that, but content. You know, there's violence, there's porn, there's things that, you know, so how do we help people listening, you know, set those limits and help their child or their person understand that there needs to be limits.
Right. Well, again, I'm going to come back to what are your limits in the family? What are your limits about what can be viewed under what circumstances? Because there may be things that you're okay with your child viewing as long as they're not viewing it out in the middle of the living room. I don't know. I'm not here to prescribe your family values to you. I am here to support you in identifying and observing your own family values. And so that's the first place, I think, is to have an understanding of what's permissible in family and what isn't. And again, this is not a new idea. I mean, I think many of our parents had the talk with us long before the internet, and we still need to have the talk with our children about all of the content that is out there. The problem, of course, is that now it's just, you know, it's gotten this magnifying glass, it's gotten this megaphone that it shouts through. And it's a question of, again, I think coming back to a discussion of limits and a discussion of values and where are you at with this, and being really real about your own limits. Like A, B, and C are not okay with me. So let's just be clear about that. And you can say that. You can say that clearly and compassionately and precisely. And one of the family connection skills is the FAST skill, where you stick to your values and you don't apologize for your values and you don't apologize for having a request or a need. And it can be that clear: for this family to function, X, Y, and Z, off limits.
And I want to validate those people out there, because I think I remember when my son, you know, when he was younger and then he wanted to watch the adult content, you know, the video games, the war games and things like that. And as parents, it's a challenge when all of their friends are doing it. And, you know, that's what you often get, you know, all my friends are doing that. And I think the way I was able to work well was because I had been through family connections for my daughter. My son was younger. I was able, I want to really reinforce, it's important to validate first. I get it. I get that your friends are doing that. I understand. But I think when it crosses over, back to one of the other questions, was when the person can't function well, you know, that's really where you start to see disorder. They don't want to go to school because they'd rather be playing video games. They don't go out with their friends because they'd rather be. And that happens with adults. I mean, I'm sure there are spouses out there and, you know, other people's siblings, et cetera, it can happen with also.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, I'm looking at the time, and before we say goodbye, I just wanted to remind everybody what's coming up next. On Tuesday in the Family Connections Alumni Institute, we have the Live a Skillful Life series. This talk is from Marie Paul de Valdivia, and the topic is Nurturing Wisdom, the core DBT skill of wise mind, which we do learn in Family Connections. So in the chat, I am going to send the link and hope you all can join us. It is Tuesday, September 14th from 5:30 to 6:30 Eastern Time, and it will also be in the webinar format. So thank you so much for being here today. I think we've learned a lot, and I really, really loved how you weaved everything in, the systems and bringing in the validation and the family connection skills. It all just makes so much sense. And everyone, we will be sending you a recording of this webinar along with the slides. So that will be coming probably in the next couple of days. So thanks again. And we will hopefully see you all at another Alumni Institute event. Thanks so much. Bye, everybody. Bye.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Should I stay online here, or are we? Oh, this is from Rada.
I have to end it for all.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay, thanks.